So I think they also are, but I can't like get any of the I can't explore that. So should we share it with the that's yeah, I don't know how to rate you missing, but I think right. Hello. Okay, so if I need because I didn't pay $11 usually does to get out. Yeah, and then
if you should hear a scream, I'm on the side. Interesting. Well, I suppose it's not surprising under the. Drag it into the screen, then
it's just basically right there. Can you make that? Yeah, I think it's good. Yeah, I'm learning more about it.
It's like I don't have feelings.
Sorry, y'all, just 1 second. Layers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Did I do a good job?
And then
Was reaching for the back of your and you're not the first person to ask.
and make sure you guys speaking.
She was, what is that? I know that's going.
And also.
Yeah, I'm on that page, so I get confused.
The mic working, okay? Yes, yes, no, mic is. Yeah, close. Maybe you have to lean in very really. I think you could. Okay, I'm just gonna project. Can you hear me, Kabir? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Bradshaw. You're here at the Wash Insecurity in Appalachia Stories and Solutions session. Today, we're going to take about 20 minutes or so to talk through some of our real world experiences and the situations that are happening in Appalachia, and specifically in Central Appalachia, in Appalachia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, And then we're going to go into some breakout sessions and look at some kind of real world examples of what is happening in Appalachia and have you think through those and think through some of the ways that you might approach solving these issues. So first off, so today our main speakers are from DigDeep and Virginia Tech. My name is Abby Bradshaw. I'm our field engineer at Appalachia Water Project. I'm based in McDowell County, West Virginia, which is the very far southern county in West Virginia. I have a background in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Kansas and the University of Colorado, Mortensen Center. And now I am, in West Virginia, and I work for Appalachia Water Project. We also have with us today, Dr. Leanne Komitas and Dr. Alistair Cohen, who are professors at Virginia Tech in biological systems engineering and environmental epidemiology, right?
Yes, you got it.
Population health sciences.
Population health sciences. There's a lot. And so we've gotten really lucky to collaborate with Dr. Komitas and Dr. Cohen over the last couple of years on a lot of our projects and to get to work together on solving some of these solutions. So today they're going to be coming up and joining me and talking about a little bit of their work before we get into the breakout sessions. So about DigDeep, DigDeep is a human rights organization based in Los Angeles, and we have project offices throughout the United States. Our project offices are based in Navajo Nation, in El Paso at the US-Mexico border, and then in Central Appalachia. And our organization started out pretty small and has grown a lot, grown very significantly over the last few years. And our aim is focusing on closing the water and sanitation access gap in the United States. We know that over 2 million people in the United States are still without access to clean running water. And I think most people are extremely surprised about that because in the US, the majority of people have the privilege of being able to just turn on their tap at their sink and drink that water, and also to be able to flush their toilet and know that it's going to somewhere reliable, that it's getting treated. So what is Appalachia? Appalachia is a very large region of the country. I think most people don't realize that Appalachia technically stretches all the way up through New York and then all the way down through Georgia, through Alabama. And Appalachia has a really diverse group of states, a really diverse group of politics, people, backgrounds, and specifically today, what we're going to be looking at is this Central Appalachian region. And so Dr. Cohen, in a recent paper by Amanda, right? Mm-hmm. By Alistair's PhD student, Amanda Darling, they found this complete lack of papers focused on water in the Central Appalachian region. And you can see here at the map, this is where, we'll show you another slide, but this is where McDowell County is. And this whole region basically has no representation in academic studies and academic papers, and basically shows, this is also represented by the work that DigDeep Labs does, where we've seen that there is a complete lack of data essentially in the United States to represent accurately water and sanitation access in the United States. And as we all know, when you don't have data to prove that something's happening, even if we know anecdotally that it is happening, it's really difficult to convince funders, the government, and other people that we need support, that we need funding to be able to fix this issue.
Amen.
Now, this little county here that you see is McDowell County, and McDowell County is centered kind of right smack dab in the middle of Central Appalachia. And McDowell County is really best known for being in the heart of coal country, and it was in the heart of coal production. And today, most people know we still have a lot of coal production, a lot of coal leaving the county every day. And at its height, McDowell County had over 100,000 people. We had, really rich communities, rich, diverse communities who had people from Scots-Irish background, and then a lot of people who came over from all different European countries. Just a very diverse group of people who came to this place, looked for work, and found communities and stayed there for a really long time. And even though there are a lot of difficulties in Appalachia, we have families who really love where they live and love being there and have a reason that they want to stay there. They don't just want to leave. They don't just want to go somewhere else that has access. They want to be able to have access to safe water and sanitation services where they live at. And we think that people deserve to have that. So the issue here, we know that families in Appalachia are living without running water. And why is that? How did we get here? So as I said, McDowell County was one of the richest counties in the United States in the early 1900s and through the 1950s. Like I said, the population in 1950 hit 100,000 in McDowell County. And this was all because of extractive industries, because of the coal companies, because of the steel companies. On the left here, you can see Gary, West Virginia, which was a prosperous coal town. It had, you can see here, this was the clubhouse for US Coal and Coke Company. And this really just shows the amount of wealth that was based in this county for a really long time. As you drive through Gary, you see what we kind of call like Millionaires Row or Bosses Row, that are just these rows and rows of huge, expensive, beautiful houses that took many hours of labor, many thousands of dollars to build at a time when you had people who wanted to and needed to live there because of industry. You also had, examples of our coal mining infrastructure that you see on the right. We still have a lot of that infrastructure throughout the county today. A lot of it might look a little bit different. This was an example on the left of Welch, our county seat. That's where I live in 1946. And in 1946, it looked a lot different than it looks today. At that time, we had multiple movie theaters, we had department stores, we had healthcare, grocery stores, essentially anything you needed to live a full and complete life with your family. You had good schools, you had access to healthy foods, you had, everything you needed. This is an aerial view of downtown Welch at the time. People always say that it was even difficult to find parking downtown during those days because you just had so many people around all the time. It was the place that people went to get all of their services, to buy things. And so for decades, these coal camps, these small towns that were located throughout the county, that were the center of coal production, were also the center of all of these people's familial life, their social life, and their economic life. So that meant that they relied on the infrastructure in these coal camps for everything, because oftentimes they weren't even paid in US dollars, they were paid in scrip. And so you would rely on the services within your coal camp. You would go to the grocery store that was at your company store, which was owned by the coal company, but you had access to these things. And if you look at these pictures, they kind of look similar. You have row houses, you have these houses that are built similarly, but look like well-constructed houses, places where families might have, thrived, had raised their kids, raised different generations of their families. But the difference between these photos is that on the left, a lot of these houses probably, had access to some form of water and sanitation infrastructure. A lot of them actually had piped water. We don't know, the level of how clean that water was, but a lot of these people had piped water. And even if they maybe didn't have sewer treatment, they had sewer collection. And so their sewer was leaving their house. It wasn't being deposited straight into their backyard. On the right, a lot of these houses, even though they might be in the same exact places, now have lost access to those water and sanitation services. And the reason for that is because the coal companies historically paid for, operated, and maintained these water and sanitation systems that they had installed. So when you came in, you had those 100,000 people, you had these towns building water and sanitation infrastructure to serve 100,000 people, because you had to have workers. You had workers, their families, you had to have infrastructure for the schools, for everything else. And as the coal companies started to leave, which began with mechanization in the 1970s, the population quickly started to drop. Just about 20 years later, the population had dropped to 75,000. And then today in McDowell County, our population is less than 20,000 people. So you can think of pretty much 70 years later, going from 100,000 people to 20,000 people. So when you have these systems that are privately owned by coal companies, all of a sudden your population drops over 70 years, and a lot of those coal companies leave, or a lot of those towns become suddenly not owned by the coal companies anymore. What happens? What impact does that kind of change have in Appalachia today? Well, we know that as they leave town, they leave behind aging and failing infrastructure that was probably installed in the early 20th century. And maybe it was maintained well up through the 1950s, but as that population started to decline, maybe more and more of the people who were responsible at the coal company for that infrastructure moved out, that infrastructure kept aging. And in the 70s, we know that a lot of people in the United States were having big investment in centralized water and sewer. But these communities were missing out on that government investment in water and sewer because they technically already had water and sewer access, right? But it was failing. It was already falling apart. So right here is actually a water extraction point in Kimball, West Virginia, which is just 10 minutes down the road from where I live. And when the EPA administrator, Michael Regan, was in McDowell County last October, just about a year ago, we took him there and showed him this plant. And now, to most people, this looks like a falling apart brick structure, which is what it is. But inside it has a pump that is still pulling water out and sending that water to the residents of a couple of nearby towns. In the US, this shouldn't be, in the richest country in the world, this shouldn't be how we're getting water and sending it out to our residents. This pump fails frequently. This water point will technically have boil water advisories. It's unreliable. And so when you have these aging and failing lines, the service lines and the main lines start to break down. A lot of these lines were built, like I said, in the early 20th century. We had sort of a landslide last year in Welch, and a water main got broken. And when they dug that water main out, the pipe was listed as from 1912. So we had people in my town who were still relying on water being transmitted through a pipe from over 100 years ago. A lot of these pipes might even be made of things like terracotta, which we know over time are essentially just gonna crumble underground. And when that happens, the water is gonna become unsafe for consumption. You're gonna have pressure leaks. You're gonna be, have all these issues. So the declining tax bases lead to increases in maintenance costs. When you have less tax bases, you have less people there to spread that cost across, then more and more people are going to be responsible for carrying that cost. Or less people are going to be responsible for that cost. And so because of this, we know that a lot of our families have to rely on different sources like hauled water, rainwater, or spring water, which can have varying levels of reliability. So we're going to have Leanne, Dr. Kamidas and Dr. Cohen come up. And
Leanne is fine. Goodness gracious. No, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done. And one thing I always like to say that I love about working with DigDeep is that we have these wonderful national surveys of ACS data, of CIDWA violations, but it really doesn't get down to the lived experience of being without water, which is something that I feel like you're doing a very excellent job. We're all together explaining what this is about. So when we talk about water hauling, this is actual pictures we've taken from a community we work with. That means that you're going to a mountain spring, pause on what a mountain spring actually is, and filling up that cistern and then taking it up the mountain and putting it in your house. Oops, oh, there you go. Yeah, oh, I'm good. Okay. And so these sources are often unsafe and unreliable. You'll see this cistern here, which is kind of a catch basin for an underground spring, which is not a spring, it's always surface water. But here you can see a piece of algae and biofilm that has just been peeled off. There's no chlorine or treatment. This is just water. This is just a storage system before it's hauled up the mountain. The most common, we've been monitoring roadside springs all up and down kind of the Valley and Ridge and Appalachian Plateau, and Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina. And you're not going to be surprised that the most common issue is E. coli. The interesting thing is that when you see something here, this is like kind of beautiful, looks like a waterfall. It's right on it's on the main road, Coal Heritage Parkway. But this is not actual spring water. We think of spring water as underground water. All of these springs are essentially re-emergent surface water. So we have a karstic geology, or in this case, this is actually an underground mine that has filled up post-closure and is now resurfacing. So the most common issue that we see is E. coli. And even if there are a couple springs that are a little more your typical fresh mountain spring, like you'd see on a Dasani commercial, but you have to remember that storage and hauling are a big issue as well. So sometimes when the water is stored, again, this is a cistern, right? Doesn't look like some of the best management practice cisterns. But if you bring that water to your home, we were actually monitoring a spring with no E. coli, no PFAS, and we found that then at the point of use, so once the water had been taken up and stored here, then at the home, it was 100% coliform positive, 60% E. coli positive, and all of a sudden we were finding PFAS, right? Because it's probably makeshift plumbing, it's leaching from inside the home. And so I'm gonna let Alistair talk a little bit more about broad science in the region. This isn't just West Virginia.
Thank you, Abby and Leanne. And so I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Bermudez, her colleagues, Abby, her colleagues in West Virginia with some of the research studies Dr. Bermudez was leading. Parallel to that, we have a number of studies also in Central Appalachia, but in far Southwest Virginia, so on the border with Kentucky and Tennessee. And a lot of these in collaboration with East Tennessee State University and my primary collaborator, Dr. Beth O'Connell. Just want to give her a shout out there for some of what I'll be sharing. So this just to share some results, just to give you a bit of context for the region more broadly. The preview is we're seeing a lot of very similar issues in far Southwest Virginia. So these are results from a very small study we did. So this was in collaboration with a county level utility that was interested in expanding water supply to a cluster of homes on private wells. And so here, for all the work I'm going to present, when we collect water samples from homes, we collect usually 2 to 3 sets of samples. So first we'll collect the set from whatever tap faucet is used. And as you've heard, and you'll see, oftentimes the source water that a home uses is not necessarily what they're using for drinking water. There's a lot of reliance on bottled water. But whatever their primary source is, wherever they get it, we'll collect the sample from there. That's what we call here the tap sample. Then we'll sterilize the faucet, flush it for 5 minutes, and collect another batch of samples, which we call the source water sample. So here, source means whatever the household source is, whether it's utility water, private well, spring water. And the reason we do that is we want to understand and control for the water quality impacts from premise plumbing, from household plumbing. So also collecting data on the age of the home and factors like that. So just briefly, one of the things, so this study, all of these homes were relatively low income. I'll show you results from another study in a moment. But the key takeaway here is we saw a lot of contamination in the source water and the tap water. And in addition to seeing indicators like E. coli, we also saw detected specific pathogens, enteric pathogens, like Aeromonas, Campylobacter, and Enterobacter. And this is in people's well water. Now, about more than half of these households were not drinking their well water. But interestingly enough, the perceptions of water quality didn't necessarily align with the actual water quality. So for some of the homes, and this is, I think, something probably familiar to many of you, working with homes on well water. So some households, the response was, because as I mentioned, for all of our studies, and Dr. Bermudez as well, we share testing results back with households. That's one of the first things we do well before we publish. As well as resources and information about the findings and what it means. And so interestingly, for some of the households where the well water was quite contaminated, the response oftentimes was, well, we've been drinking this for generations and we're fine. Now, also, I've had other experiences where with that information, people then switch away from drinking that water to another water source. Okay, so this, what I'm showing on this slide, these are results from another study we're doing. So this is in these 2 counties in Wise and Lee, and this is in collaboration with the Appalachian Service Project. So these are relatively low income, predominantly rural counties. And so in this study, we're looking at households on utility water, well water, and spring water, doing the same types of sampling and analysis. And also for these studies, we collect data on reported health outcomes. For a number of health outcomes, but for now I'll just focus on gastrointestinal upset and diarrhea. And this is my fantastic postdoc, Dr. Rashid Usman, who's arriving today and also presenting tomorrow. And in collaboration with EPA, we also collect saliva swabs to look at antibody responses to better understand historic infections with waterborne pathogens. So a number of findings just to share from this. One was, so this is data from 33 households in 2 counties and from 83 individuals within the homes. The households on utility water are served by 9 different community water systems, which might be surprising to some because these are relatively low population density counties, and that's a lot of systems. That's something somewhat typical for Central Appalachia, more smaller systems. And there's other research evidence pointing to some of the challenges that smaller systems face in reliably providing safe water. So here, fortunately for these areas, the water from supplied by the utilities looked pretty good overall. So that was really nice to see. Not so much for those households on well and spring water, and that aligned with what Dr. Komitas and others are seeing in West Virginia. So a lot of E. coli contamination, total coliforms as well. Then I don't have the results here to show you, but I can just tell you for the antibody response data, we saw evidence of higher prevalence than perhaps would have been expected for pathogens like Cryptosporidium, protozoal pathogen, for things like Campylobacter, even we saw some hepatitis E. So this plus other electronic health record data we have access to from healthcare providers in the area suggests that in some of these counties, there's probably a much larger burden of disease associated with contaminated water than is kind of, making it to the top of the clinical surveillance pyramid. And that's one of the things we're trying to understand, like what are the actual exposures, what types of households have more or less exposure, and then thinking very much to the next steps, just as DigDeep is what can be done about it? What interventions could be done to expand safe water access? So I think so just very briefly, we in this and other research I've done, we kind of see trends of an increasing reliance on bottled water in rural areas. And a lot of this is driven by perceptions, but a lot of it is also just driven by a lack of access to reliably safe water, in which circumstances using bottled water makes a lot of sense. In low middle income country context, some of our research has shown bottled water is not always as safe as it would be expected. So in this setting, this is the study my postdoc's leading. We bought every brand and size of bottled water sold in a county and tested it for a number of different parameters, heavy metals, et cetera. And so the results from that should be coming out soon. I'll just give you a preview, big picture. Bottled water is generally safe, all things being equal. Well, if you have more questions about the water, ask me when I'm potentially out bigger. The paper is going to come out. But big picture of the bottled water in this region. I will share two last things and then get back to the presentation. One is in the study I just showed you before. We have a paper coming out soon, and one of the figures we looked at some of the primary water quality indicators and physical chemical parameters for those with utility water. And then we separated the results for whether the household drinks bottled water or not. And this might not be surprising to some of you, but we saw no significant differences. So at least in that setting, in those households, there wasn't the choice of a household to use bottled water rather than their tap water was not at all associated with water quality as we measured it. Now, that's not to say that that's always the case. And there are certainly places where the water is not safe, and that's a good reason to drink bottled water. Yeah, so I will wrap up with that. If you have questions about this study or any others, please find me after. Glad to do it.
Thank you. So our last kind of main thing here before we get into some of the stuff for the workshop is that we also just briefly know that in addition to water, wastewater is kind of the stepchild of a lot of the wash field. A lot of people don't enjoy thinking about or doing wastewater work as much, but wastewater is just as big of an issue, and it's contributing to the water quality issue. In McDowell County, again, a callback, we don't have great data. The last large analysis of wastewater access in McDowell County was in the early 2000s, and it showed us that probably around 60% of our county was straight piping or directly discharging all of their waste into rivers or streams or down the sides of mountains. And so when you have that much of a toxin load going into your rivers, you know that that's going to lead to massive water quality impacts. So now this is kind of stuff to start thinking about for this workshop portion, for what we're going to talk about today. So we also know that extractive industry impacts all of these things. We have impacts from timbering, from logging, but also from coal companies. And all of this leads to and kind of sets the stage for this long-term environmental degradation and public health catastrophe. Oops. And so first off, we know that there's the impact of water pollution. And so this can be wildlife and ecosystem degradation. Like we said, that can be die-offs or low oxygen levels in rivers and streams. That can be long-term groundwater impacts. You can see wells becoming contaminated that maybe were reliable for many decades before, or wells just completely running dry or being sunk. But then also we have acute and chronic health impacts. The acute impacts we know directly are happening. The chronic health impacts we can see anecdotally that throughout communities there is evidence of chronic and long-term impacts such as cancers, kidney issues, liver issues that are happening in communities that are impacted by contaminated water near extractive industries. Additionally, flooding is a huge issue in McDowell County in 2001 and 2002, and most recently in Kentucky, as some of you might remember last summer, there is massive flooding. And some of this can be attributed to the lack of anchoring topsoil, less ground coverage when you look at entire mountainsides being stripped down either for mountaintop removal or for logging. You have less vegetation to hold water, less vegetation and soil that's absorbing water. So you're going to have, at the end of the day, more water coming into communities and leading to massive death, injuries, loss of life, loss of household objects, losing your household, clogged and damaged watersheds, all that kind of stuff. So what we're going to look at today is kind of these cycles of poverty and also what impacts your ability to bring services to people. So I always describe it as sort of this cycle or as a layered issue in McDowell County and in Central Appalachia in general. You have people who don't have access to many great jobs because jobs are leaving the area, and then limited transportation. So if you can find a job, maybe it's an hour away, so you're having to drive to get there, but what if you don't have a good car? It's going to take you a long time. You have high housing vacancy. There's a lack of available rental houses. And a lot of times, even if you can buy or rent a house, it might have been impacted by mold that is left over from massive flooding, or it's just generally not been taken care of. You have limited resources for health and education. And at the end of the day, decreasing population on top of all this. So knowing all this history is key to identifying solutions, which is what we're going to think about now in our little breakout sessions. So what we're going to give you, we're going to break into, I think we'll do 4 or 5 groups, and we'll probably just have you kind of split up by the areas here. And so each group is going to be given a WASH case study. So we're going to hand out some little handouts, and they're going to give you some situations. And so there'll be an area, and then it'll say, here's 2 options. And you're going to consider as if you're maybe the utility, or you're maybe in my position as engineer, you're thinking, what is the best option out of these 2? And we want you to, there's going to be a lot of information left out. You can make as many assumptions as you want, obviously, but we want you to consider in our position, what do you think the best solution would be, all things considered? Now we know in reality, this would take a lot of input from our communities. This would take a lot of considerations for historical solutions and all of these different things. But we just want you to take some time to get creative and think about, in the US, what does it take to solve some of these solutions? How is it similar or different to the international context? And then at the end, we're all going to come back together and we'll have someone from your group present out what you choose for your solution and kind of why you've decided that. So these are kind of some things that you can use to think about when you're looking at this. So now we can sort of split up. Let's see here, maybe like Yeah, maybe this. Y'all can.
This would be, any.
Here's but also, yeah. A couple of guys. Y'all back here. And then. Together this way.
Yeah, I already did this before. Great job. Thank you.
Well, for now, we can.
Y'all wanna scenario like that. Yeah, someone could try to be a note taker if we want to.
Australia. So.
Someone wants to say something. Challenge. I guess we're.
Oh. In your home. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And down the. Are like.
Yeah, so I think we have to think through what different, considering some of these things, local boards, sort of what, what different considerations might come. Thinking about whether you're, what. What do you think? Well, you could, you can make some assumptions, so maybe is it, so in this one, for me, whether you have rainwater collection tanks or pipe water, so that pipe water will probably be, as far as like the animals thinking, so generally it might be pretty good, but could be. You could have some heavy metal contamination possibly. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, sort of.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Not generally. Usually you're kind of on your. So what's someone gonna be a spokesperson? Yeah, right, yes.
Same families, aging population, very far.
A long term.
Potentially, many.
Insecurity and then monitor. I
Throughout the year, I'd say we have some like lives with the rainwater on I'm still trying to cover the dry seasons, but you're still getting the well, it depends. There'll be, probably, maybe 2,000 square feet, serve a small media family.
So you can do it on the house?
Yeah, you can do it on a house. I mean, you can talk, you can think about that. Yeah, a lot of wells, right? I was gonna say, so that's go dry or down. But isn't that like a shift? I think
That's one thing. Especially when I was doing it, less too simple as water is full of it's really much more.
I would say it's great.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. You know, people shut off. It often
Bottled water at least has, I'm not good at bottled water, but it is like that's a lot of, I believe, water. Green water. Yes.
Another is good. That's our one garden. They're adverse up and back. So they're getting like. No,
Yeah.
You need to go, like, how quickly that flush. Grapevine, and so they have, all of the houses will be on kind of sewage, without sewage or kind of down. Straight pipe. Everyone's shit is kind of so you could technically think about something where you're selecting everyone can have their. Did you call that?
Exist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know the details, but I know that like facilities will have like. And kind of what it's what I would have minimum. I think. I think it's sort of. And unfortunately, like 20 years now, they just. I don't think we don't see any Any future in which. Yeah. They're pretty high.
Being able to down here, yeah, notice the valleys. I think it's mostly kind of more center valleys, not along the stream, but it just depends a lot. It's hard to find kind of on the side, not closest to the street, you know, on the road side of the street, call it. Most together for us, one long, yeah.
Potentially trade. And she said, I know. There's like questions around like your population, number of moms that like this practice where you call it.
For water, how does that affect doing a community?
But
If they're on some sort of pipe, does there have to be kind of flow of water? Or is we're doing lots of that? It seems like. And something about that, I don't know if y'all, like, yeah, but also, yeah, that's something, I don't know, that caught my attention this one. Everyone had a lot of 2 more minutes, so kind of start thinking about what your solution might be and start thinking about, share that with the group of there. I'm not always better at that, but knowing that like if it's along stream and that's like gradually floods, we're thinking of like important septic system. And it put, I know, the flood or like those septic systems out of commission or something, you know, where would the resources come from or the federations and areas needed to expand building on that. But I don't know if any of you have experience that working with grant and different. One thing that I was saying. Yeah. Experience. I know. Yeah. Like we live on a rural area in North Carolina. We were responsible for defending rights, working in jail and making well instruction. That makes the movement remain from the farms after the already we belong to the others up there.
Some of the areas. You don't have.
But it put extra burden on them.
No.
Care.
Yeah, rainwater.
Their fees for collection.
We don't even day-to-day chores, we add another weekly chore after that.
On that road, I'll share it with you.
Just for context, I do think of kind of the outside. You know, there are models where they say county level utilities. And they will put in 12 and then it's possible. You will have to be able to for well, just but where that one off is. But I think, yeah, at least from my experience with that, I think it's very much it's on the utility. But that kind of go out with like 2,500. Yeah, it's not a hard, this is the utility.
Back together. Give you 30 seconds to figure out who's gonna report. Anyone want to report? Yeah.
Is this the area that I'm with you and.
It is fixed already. I can give you that. Yeah. 101. Bring water. It's gonna, it isn't the exact same thing, but. In similar situations, it would take like 4 or 5 conversations. To get help out there. Most of these people, their wells are under dry. This hugely burdensome to treatment level. And just don't like that. Plus you're making it for, oh, yeah. Yeah, but those are gonna be our projects, so, yeah, I can, but yeah. The way that they're posted, there's under, garnish.
Will that be reverbed or there?
Yeah, but I think it's gonna be this other.
So out there. This is the all.
Don't even have access to.
One.
For real hardware. We live in Appalachia, right? Reliable access to. Yeah, I don't know. Hey, everyone, who wants to report out first? Okay, listen up. Okay, so while this group going first, you could give us a little bit of a summary of what your situation was and.
Okay, so this is we're the Panther Group, and we are looking at an area with 25 families. The homes are not connected to local sewer. So household waste currently is straight piped into nearby streams. The demographics, it's a mixed age population with year-round occupancy of the homes, but there is some hunting tourism. This, the homes are mainly in a valley and they lie along the stream. The community is low-lying and experiences frequent floods. The houses, the 25 houses are also dispersed within this community. So our potential solutions for sanitation were individual septic systems or community waste collection and treatment. And in terms of the septic system, with the frequent flooding, the septic systems are going to represent a challenge and probably not compatible with that environment. So we spent the most time looking at community waste collection and treatment. In terms of like a traditional community waste and treatment like we have, we thought there might be a lot of expenses for just 25 families to hold. And so then some other alternatives for community waste treatment were in-house collection of waste at a house. And then a service, I guess, comes by and collects the waste and takes it away for treatment. So almost like not a porta potty, but kind of like that, where you combine it with porta potty and take it for treatment. Or another alternative might be to super straight pipe. So straight pipe, but not to the stream, but to an area where we could aggregate the waste and then treat it from there. And the group was definitely sensitive to the perceptions of the homeowners, so they want to do a perception analysis and a financial analysis before making a final decision.
Awesome. Let's see.
I wanted to go now. At the end, to say something, but I want to say that at the end, I'm going to I'm really good at this position and they put me in the spot to do this. So, it's terrifying. So you've got 20 families. I just learned what APB means, all terrain vehicle. The current implementation system is that homes are not connected to those and household waste. I think very similar to yours. It's straight pipe into the nearby stream. The difference is that the demographics in our case study is an aging population year round. I thought that was quite funny because like, well, yeah, they obviously they get older every single year, but then I realised what and 80 tourists and their season. And the terrain is in a valley with a stream running alongside the community. So that featured in our discussion because it affected the viability of the job as well. Individual septic system and community waste collection. We realised that doing so in a valley could be challenging. So the challenges in the community, and this is why we've ended up with a controversial proposal, is that the low-lying community risk of flooding, the population can decline, and it's near former mining operations. So we had a bit of a discussion about what the potential contribution of the former mining operation is to the local area, and whether do nothing might be a viable option, because both of the proposals won't address the major environmental problems in that area. So we'd like to look at the numbers for a bit more.
But I'll do nothing for how long? Well, I'm just
That's really the brilliance about do nothing is that it's not a permanent decision, it's a no regrets decision. So you can look at it in another year or another 2 years or whatever. Sorry, the two options are separate tank systems, which I felt had some pros because they're a shorter term solution than a small period system, which I think was a longer term investment. But I think ultimately it comes down to the 20 families, which and the people. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
I think we can get away with it.
Yeah, no right answer. Y'all in the back?
So we're transitioning kind of back into water. So our community was animal, it's only 7 families. The homes are not connected to the local water utilities, and families currently haul water from mountainside springs and they buy bottled water and stuff like that. We also have a mixed age demographic that includes children, there's year-round occupancy, and the families are all low income. As the terrain, like the mountaintop community with very steep roads and yards. And the challenges are that specifically the community is located near mining operations, and the homes in the community are far from the existing utility farms. So our block solution options were either to drill a deep well to a potential aquifer seam or to extend the water pipelines that exist. And we kind of discussed the pros and cons of each of them that we knew already. So with the well, we have obviously water quality concerns. You don't necessarily know what's in there, as well as the cost of drilling, and then concerns about if there's enough viable water in the aquifer to actually serve all these families. But then for the extended pipeline, there's obviously again a cost concern, as well as these families are on top of a mountain, and so you have pressure concerns, either up or down, depending on where the stream is located. And you also have concerns about the terrain in terms of if you're going to be able to lay the pipe underground or if you lay it above ground, etc. And so
the group kind of ended up deciding that we needed more information, things like the financial viability of these things, as well as who might pay for them. And like, if there are funding options that, you know, the community is eligible for, as well as things like obviously what the communities want, as well as who will be maintaining them. Before we can make like a reasonable decision, given how few families there are and the difficulties.
Yeah, awesome, thanks. Good job, everyone. Now, y'all, last group.
Please.
Yeah.
So, hi,
No wrong answer.
thank you. It's a good way to start. So, background, very similar to the one we just heard. 10 families, homes are not connected to the local water supply, and families are hauling water from mountainside springs and buying bottled water. The demographics, unlike what we just heard, the demographics are an aging population, but yes, with year-round occupancy and low income. The terrain is also, like much of West Virginia, mountaintop communities, steep roads and yards. And in addition to the challenges we just heard, with families living miles from the closest utility water lines, we also have homes that are rural and dispersed from one another. As a part of this this community. And the two wash solutions that we were presented with were, one was extend a piped water line, which is something we thought about, and the other was build individual rainwater collection tanks. And well, I think we were, of course, there's some natural appeal to extending piped water lines for all that brings. Looking at an aging population, a small community, the difficult terrain, the costs involved, it's pretty clear that isn't necessarily feasible or practical or the best use of this utility's limited resources. Building individual white rainwater collection tanks seems to be a good alternative. I think, and that's where we focused our discussion. I think we just had a lot of discussion around rainwater collection tanks, just like aren't a ready-made solution. Also, there's the quality of, there's the potability of water in rainwater collection tanks. There's the chlorination, the mineralization, and the maintenance of those simple systems, etc. So, and also there was some discussion about whether this small community was entitled to receive, should be receiving some kind of support for the investment that it has to make, that the utility or others who have some responsibility for providing water aren't making in that instance. I don't know what would happen in reality, but it's certainly a worthwhile discussion. Anything else this group wants, our group wants to add?
At least I would have a question about the volume of water that you collect with rains. I always think of running things like washing machines and that sort of thing. So, I mean, it's fine for drinking, but I don't know if you get the volumes that you need for domestic water use. And I mean, more information about the groundwater potential would be useful because the quality can vary from place to place. And if it is an option to have deeper household boreholes with treatment, then that might be, I mean, that's the sort of solution that other rural dispersed households would have in other high income countries. I recognize things are a bit different here, but it's, yeah, that option would be the first sort of protocol to the groundwater potential in a small household well that was drilled in a way, which, or the prospecting was done in a way that you would know the potential of that well would seasonally dry and dry permanently. So then you could make a decision about whether or not to do it.
One thing we learned, I don't know, I can't recall how we learned this, maybe we have, is that there was a lot of rainfall. There was year-round rainfall, not to the exclusion of, not in competition, but it didn't come, it wasn't written here, but we learned that.
Anything else?
But I think it raises the issue, your point about, the amount of water comes back to then, what are the in-home appliances? Right, and if they're sort of older generation, heavy water use appliances, you're possibly gonna have more of a problem instead of. You can't work the in-home from the water supply.
Yeah, and these are all really great reflections. Since we have a few minutes, I kind of wanted to open the floor to a little more group discussion as well, and see if anyone, after thinking about all these scenarios, has any thoughts about, maybe the differences between implementing or finding solutions domestically versus internationally, whether there's any major differences that stand out to you between differences or similarities that stand out to you between finding solutions in the international wash world versus the domestic wash world, or maybe just if you had any other big light bulb moments come up while you were thinking through these. Yeah.
I'm curious if for these two situations, water delivery, like you do in the nomination, would be appropriate.
So, I mean, and anyone else, feel free to jump in on this, but I think, at least for me, my major concern about water delivery is the sustainability in the long term. And I'm just speaking for Appalachia and my project is I don't want to start implementing something that we have to be here for, because in reality, water and utilities should be the responsibility of our government to be providing to the people, and people should, I personally think that should be a right for people to have a utility that is maintained and kept by the government. And so I don't want to be implementing a solution that's going to be relying on us long-term to be there. But also when you look at a place like Appalachia, you have major terrain issues. We have places that even like our big four-wheel trucks have a hard time getting up to sometimes. It takes a long time to get places. So it's kind of another one of those back and forth trade-offs. Maybe it can be a short-term good solution, but it also comes with difficulties. Yeah.
How much do the residents want a community water system, like a utility, versus their own household water supplies?
I think it depends. I mean, in my experiences at least, what do you think, Susan? Like,
We haven't surveyed that specifically.
yeah, I think we haven't done specific surveys on it, but anecdotally, it really varies. A lot of people, even when the water utility brings in a line, I have plenty of families who have still chosen to not connect because they had a spring in their hauler that they have used for their whole life. Maybe their parents even use water from that spring, and they just simply trust that water more and they like the taste of it better. And so it would take a pretty huge behavior change and, campaign that's kind of a decision of whether that's ethical or not to make people switch off of a system that they're happy with, even though we know there can be quality concerns. But it really just depends. A lot of people, we have people who cry and are, very extremely excited to be on centralized water because it brings access to a service that they haven't had, and the ability to take a shower or wash your clothes and not have to go to your neighbor's house or go down the street to your grandmother's house to take a shower. It's life-changing, but you have people who also rely on systems that they've used for their whole lives and they don't necessarily want to change from that. So yeah.
So is there space in your work to make the preferences safer versus try to bring them the utility, which is your natural institution?
Yeah, and I think that's what we're working on too, is always considering what the household prefers and how you can, even if there's not some big solution we can implement, if you can even get a pitcher filter or something like that to at least reduce some level of contamination. But
I mentioned the affordability piece, people going on to new water bill.
you want to say it?
Yeah, sure. That's part of the first question. Is part of the issue also is that a lot of these families and homes are not used to paying the water bill in that particular way. So adding an additional cost to what was essentially free water, right? Not for most cases, and a lot of it obviously has significant health impacts, so not free over time, but that level of finding to make, how to make it affordable is gonna need to come from the government side too, to make it an accessible option. Just because there is an option doesn't make it accessible for everyone.
Yeah,
You asked about comparisons with international work. I think this, like what I've heard a lot around the last mile, you refer to the last mile, the hardest to reach in a country, the most remote, the most financially challenging, because
Yeah.
it costs a lot, so very direct comparison. But the other comparison that strikes me in a rather shocking way is usually governments in the south don't have necessarily the financial muscle and the wherewithal, the competency to deal with those communities. But, you know, we're talking about the USA.
Yeah.
Where is the government in all this, or state, federal, you know, why is it not addressing these issues? I mean, it's absolutely shocking, to be
Yeah.
honest.
yeah.
I just don't understand it.
That's the longer discussion.
Just to add to that, and I don't think I can help you understand it, or not in a few minutes anyway. But one of the things that came up in our group discussion too was thinking about there are some models. So one of the kind of cutoffs for water that's EPA regulated is 25 steady connections, but there are exceptions to that, and so it is possible, and there are models where utilities, larger, better equipped to manage utilities, could potentially take responsibility for kind of decentralized wells that serve a few homes and provide some sort of annual, semi-annual, water testing.
Yeah.
And everything. So it's not impossible, but our regulatory system is not set up to make that easy. I think.
Yeah.
So all of this investment is supposed to be private on behalf of the householders themselves, or?
Investment from whom? From,
Well, exactly, from whom?
yeah.
It's supposed to come from them.
Yeah, well, so, and that's one of the disparities here, right, is that when you live in a place where you have access to centralized water, I mean, I grew up in a place where my family didn't have to build the lateral from our house to the water line. We lived in a city of 500,000 people, but the tax base, the cost of water utility was spread over a huge number of people. We only had to pay a small amount comparatively per month to cover the cost of maintenance and repairs in our water system, right? But when you look at these smaller systems, the investment and then the cost of utility and maintenance is going to a much smaller group of people, and people who are generally much lower income and older, often on fixed incomes. And so even if you have an investment, then there's not really much good investment for operation and maintenance, and to support your utilities and finding people who can run the systems, who are qualified to run the systems. So yeah, it's a huge, long problem. Career.
Yeah, as part of that too, even in places that do have bigger systems for households such as like mobile homes or other smaller homes that people do live in, that cost to connect, like Abby mentioned, just to illustrate it a little bit, we know one person whose family lived in a mobile home where the connection would have cost $15,000 just to connect herself. And she was a mother of several children, single mother, low income, did not have that capital, but she lived feet away from the nearest water main. And we see communities right as part of counties that have very large cities, like in El Paso and Texas, that are within a mile of the nearest water connection, but it is that inability to pay that singular connection that is causing these particular issues. So part of options include diversification of funding, cut some of that red tape with private, philanthropic, and government entities. And we pushed for private, public, nonprofit partnerships to exist for that reason, so that we can just get the money in the right place right away without having to wait.
Is there a hand back there? Yeah.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about like the central parallels between these domestic settings and the international setting, my project works in rural South Sudan, and I wouldn't have thought that there's a lot of crossover with Appalachia. When we're diving into this more, I'm actually seeing some of the similarities, both in very inaccessible remote communities, water access in Appalachia. There's a lot more rainfall, and it's accessible that way, but just simply having the infrastructure and maintaining it, in rural South Sudan, the boreholes that are drilled, are used nonstop, just, throughout the day, throughout the night, with inevitable breakdowns, and then that leads to long delays until a technician can get out there and repair it, and that's a critical time. And what we're trying to think about is like, how can we train folks on how to prepare themselves? How can we have them manage the funding that's needed to then buy new equipment or parts and stuff to make those repairs? And in our example, and like thinking back on it, I find myself leaning more towards the, well, yes, the water, like connecting to the pipeline is a more ideal solution, but then they are reliant on a utility company that maybe isn't as responsive to inevitable breakdowns, and maybe some sort of hybrid situation with rainfall, collecting rainfall, and then drilling into the aquifer so that when one fails, there's a kind of plan B. Is the same kind of thinking. That is, and maybe that's just like the similarities is just my brain, and like I just think about these.
No, it's,
But yeah, anyway, it's interesting. Go for it.
Al works for us. Keep going.
I think comparing to the international, international, like we work kind out in communities all the time. I think the thing that's kind of odd to me, I think they didn't point out to it would be another like water. Huge problem with the plot end of it. And this isn't gonna sound right, I don't need it to come out the way it's gonna come out, but I found myself as soon as I read all this, an elderly couple be more sensitive to that than I was necessarily on the international side. Easily put in a latrine site system in it for a, and that was sort of a very, to me, that was an awakening. Maybe I haven't been looking at the elderly couples quite much, but they do seem a little bit, we seem a little weak. I guess, a little bit. It's still an interesting thing that kind of comes.
That's a really good point. Thank you for sharing. I think one thing that if you've been coming to this conference for a while, I know my first year in 2019, there was so little talk about domestic water and sanitation, and I was still working in international development back then. And I think the change that the thing that we really want to see with coming here and starting to talk about domestic water and sanitation a lot is things like that, is where we can say, where are these cross connection points? Where can we all learn from each other? And because a lot of these things are much more similar than we realize, and just haven't had the time to think about it or haven't thought about it in a different way. And so it is really great to get to see everyone starting to have those kind of light bulb moments about how all of this is so similar. We're all just trying to serve people who live in difficult environments and who need creative solutions to get to them a lot of times, or major investment. So, Al, did you have something to add?
Sure, yeah, I was just reflecting on our do nothing proposal, which everybody's very kind about that, but just reflecting on the cost to implement these projects, whether they're individual systems or community systems, and then the lack of a workforce to implement, operate, and maintain them without subsidy, federal, state, local level, and without workforce development to be able to implement these. I think that is probably the status quo, probably is going to be maintained until we as a community, as a country, can get behind funding in supplying workforce that can actually tackle these problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. Anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
And I answer a question about the US context. So at what government level, is it national, federal, or county? Does the government have responsibility for coverage of water and sanitation services? Or in the UK, where we actually responsibility, we probably don't have one. And by virtue of having large water utilities that work in urban areas, there are still, in the same way, pockets of people who are not connected. So
Yeah, well, I'll try someone else might have a better summarized answer for this, but there's overarching federal rules. Then there are state rules for other things that vary from state to state, and some states may have different rules for different things. And then sometimes you have county level rules. I don't know, does anyone have a more succinct and well spoken?
I mean, it's a real, it's
Yeah.
patchwork and there are a lot of holes.
Yeah,
Yeah, and also I will say that there is sometimes like whether the data you want are with the local Department of Health versus Department of Environmental Quality, right? Depending on whether it's stuff people are going to drink or stuff from discharge to the environment. And sometimes it's a crossover, so it's very,
okay.
Yeah.
and there's state-led, state and federal.
Yeah.
And even at the federal level, it's split up across a lot of different federal
Yeah.
agencies that we don't have a singular regulatory agency for environmental quality or water quality control.
Yeah, I mean, bottled water and water from the community system are regulated by two totally different agencies. Bottled water is under the FDA and piped water by the US EPA.
On top of that, the US also has at least 53,000 independent utilities across all 50 states.
I'm surprised when she asked that one.
It definitely-
Kabir has covered everything.
I've been every single.
Am I right that DigDeep have been involved with a water sourcing project in Appalachia around bottled water?
Well, they're just the studies on bottled water. We did have for a while, we were using some solar panels that were able to pull water from the air, but yeah. Yeah, it was, but
That technically didn't work.
yeah, it's a difficult, I think it's something that might be able to work in some contexts, but I prefer a lower technology solution that's, so, yeah, but yeah, quick, one last quick question.
The do nothing proposal, not be thinking about perceptions. I'm guessing these are actual communities that we were discussing.
More or less, yeah.
Ballpark, you've not done the survey, but how many of these families or heads of households think this is a real problem for them? Or are they really happy with the status quo?
Again, it really depends. I think you'll come to households who, are kind of like, it is what it is. It's, if, as long as they have access to enough water, where it's not having a daily impact that they're seeing in their lives. There's some people who just have other things to worry about, and it's kind of, and especially, if a lot of these people are still mostly drinking bottled water. I don't really know anyone in my county hardly who is drinking their water, whether it's utility or, I have utility water in my town in the county seat, but I don't drink that water and I don't know anyone who does. For example, Leanne has come and tested my water and it has extremely high levels of sodium that would cause long-term health impacts if you were to drink that bottled water. But then again, there are a lot of people who are concerned about it, especially if you are seeing daily impacts in your life. If you're seeing people in your community who have illness, we know families who have, had wells that they were drinking from, and then her father suddenly passed away from kidney failure, and that well was later tested and was found to have really high levels of heavy metals. And when you do see those direct impacts and start seeing those direct impacts in your communities and in people I think that starts to raise that level of alarm a lot more, because you're seeing it happen more and more in people So it's not an easy answer, but I think there are more and more people becoming concerned about it. And again, whether or not people are thinking about it in their daily lives, everyone still deserves to have that access. And as a closing thing, I'll say, I realize I never really described this too well, but generally what DigDeep does in our communities is we try to fill that gap between access in communities. And so it's about kind of 70, 30, 80, 20, with the bigger chunk being providing access to centralized services in partnership with our local utilities. And so when our local utility runs a main line, most of the time our households do not have the capacity to afford that $1,500 or $2,000 or even up to $15,000 or $20,000 bill to construct the lateral from the main line to their household. So we can come in and cover all of the labor costs and do all of the construction for that lateral line to the household, whether it's water or sewer. And then there are times where even if the utility cannot afford to run a small section of main line because it isn't financially feasible, we sometimes can come in and actually run that small section of main line and then construct the laterals. And then the other section of that, the smaller chunk, is that we're really getting into these last couple of years is looking at decentralized solutions. And so we have a lot of families who simply aren't going to be served by centralized solutions in their lifetime or even my lifetime. And so how can we serve them in the best way that, in the way that is best for them, whether that's going to be well water, rainwater harvesting, on-site wastewater treatment systems, any of these things we talked about today, because not all solutions are equal, and not all solutions are right for all these different types of people. And people deserve to, be able to be happy and healthy in the place that they live and where they want to live. So, yesterday we had a couple presentations from Virginia Tech representation on some of that stuff we talked about, the water quality and economic implications of bottled water, and then also that systematic review of contaminants and health in Appalachia. Then there's a few more presentations from Virginia Tech that are going to be coming up about wash in Appalachia. On Wednesday, there's talk about PFAS in private drinking water systems, DBP occurrence in small water systems, and then also wastewater surveillance. So go support our Virginia Tech friends. And yeah, a big thank you. We have all of our colleagues will be around, milling around if you have more questions, want to talk, we have business cards up here. And feel free to hit us up later if you want to chat more. So thanks for all of your participation. Yeah, he has it. All of this. Yeah. Yeah, because actually, I'm working with Leanne and so she's actually